Hello everyone. Before I start, I would like to lay my cards on the table so that you know my point of view, my motives, and my religious inclinations from the start. I want to do this because very few things irritate me more than getting halfway through a video or article before I realise that the author was a rusted-on religious fanatic whose sole purpose was to champion their own brand of religious dogma. I'm not a Christian in the usual sense of the term, although I am an admirer of the psychological teachings attributed to Jesus in biblical and Gnostic literature. I also admire Eastern religious ideology and practice, but in a similar way, I would not call myself a Buddhist. There are a handful of other religious/spiritual teachings that I find valuable, but I could not find one that credibly answered my biggest questions, the existential issues that have lurked beneath the surface most of my life. You know, what am I doing here? Where did I come from? Where do I go? Is there life after death? Does life have any actual meaning and purpose? Or do we just have to invent meaning and purpose for ourselves as we go along? Is religion completely bogus? Is consciousness primary or is materiality primary? And those kind of things. It frustrated me that, particularly in Western tradition, the churches demanded that I believed for the sake of believing without a shred of evidence, because I could not do this. They would cite a quote from Jesus directed at doubting Thomas. "You believe because you have seen. Blessed is he who hath not seen and yet believes." But either this is a mistranslation or a bogus attribution, or it lacks context to some other teaching, because clearly, if we compare all the absurd religious ideas that humanity has believed and still believes in, all the religious death cults and the teaching of outright religious frauds and charlatans, then the very worst thing we could do is to believe religious claims without a shred of proof, regardless of how ridiculous they are. My personal historical brushes with religion began at the age of 6. I remember sitting in a class and listening to my religious instruction teacher. Her point of view struck me, even then, as unconvincing and tedious. Religious instruction classes were compulsory in those days, so I had to suffer through them once a week for about an hour. The nun who delivered these talks had a dour face. It was lined with those kind of creases that come from suffering, and there was nothing warm or maternal about her at all. During question time, I asked her about evolution, and she said, "Oh, you mustn't take any notice of evolutionists. They are just troublemakers." She had no interest in any other point of view. My mother had no interest in religion whatsoever, but my father did, and although he insisted that the Lord's Prayer was recited before every meal, he rarely spoke about it. He never went to church, and thankfully he never made his children go either. And that was a time when most of our neighbourhood went to church. Years later, when I was 13, I decided to give the Bible a quick read for myself, for no reason that I can remember. I took it to bed with me one night. The book fell open at Ecclesiastes, so I read a few pages. What I read troubled me because it named some of my existential concerns, and I went to sleep feeling disturbed. I didn't like that feeling at all, so I gave the Bible no further attention until I was 19, when I was compelled to spend a year going to church twice on Sundays. I was living with my uncle and auntie in another state, and going to church with them was a condition of my stay there. But I could not convince myself that the Orthodox Christian narrative was literally true, and I couldn't believe in the way these people seemed to, although at the time I very much wanted to. At 30, having completely rejected the Orthodox Christian brand, I became interested in New Age literature for a short time, but ended up dismissing it with some anger because it encouraged outrageous magical thinking at every turn, and I realised that collectively it only served to strengthen my imagination and ego, and I was interested in something else. Then I spent a long time absorbed in Eastern religious literature, and although it produced a similar imaginative state in me, there was a practical side to this teaching that very much interested me, although it was somehow inaccessible, and is quite probably inaccessible to the West in general, for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into here. I also became interested in various heterodox teachings, such as the inner teachings of Judaism, which are collectively referred to as Jewish mysticism, as well as Gnosticism and all kinds of religious symbolism. I was particularly excited by the psychological teaching of the Greek Armenian philosopher George Gurdjieff, because the subtext of his teaching served to pull together a variety of fragmented ideas I'd already accumulated from my exploration. And this stirred my interest in Christian literature again. After I'd carefully read the Bible from start to end, I read the Quran and then worked my way through the Nag Hammadi library, which is a great source of primary Gnostic literature. And it was within those texts I discovered almost word for word several ideas put forward by the famous, although currently unfashionable, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. As my scope of study expanded, I became increasingly certain that the Orthodox Christian teaching represented only a narrow, superficial interpretation of a much richer and more useful underlying body of knowledge. It became clear to me that at least another layer of meaning and another language was embedded in religious symbolism, and I struggled for the next 2 decades to make sense of it all. This study became, for me, at times an obsession. As the pieces came together, I imagined that I'd write a book about it someday. But after many attempts, I realised that I was not a good writer and no longer the time left to learn how to be. Besides that, the material was too unwieldy and included too much. So it was impossible for me to decide what I should include or leave out, or even where and how to begin. On top of that, I realised I didn't have a target audience, and I don't have academic credentials. I don't even have academically credible subject material. For a while I considered self-publishing, or as I like to call it, vanity publishing. But then it didn't seem worthwhile for the sake of a handful of disinterested relatives who might read some of it just to be polite. At the same time, because this personal exploration had become my reason for being in some real sense, I would like for it to exist somewhere outside of myself, to share what I've found for whatever it's worth, and I'm hopeful that the video format might wallpaper over some of my writing deficiencies. In the first series of videos, I want to talk about religious triads, the origin of the Christian triad, and the ideas which informed them. I think it's a good place to start because the religious triad is much more than an absurd piece of Christian dogma. Rather, it seems to be a universal principle on which our psychology, physiology, functions, evolution, and even our science is based. Thanks for listening. Hope you come along with me part of the way.